All right, yes. Oh, PowerPoint has been shared in your Dropbox, so you can follow it along in your PowerPoint. Yeah.
Awesome. Israel is 10,000 square miles. The Big Island is 4,000.
6,000.
I found 4,000. Huh?
Mine said 8,000.
Israel.
All right, so it's like twice as big, something like twice as big. All right, I was close. I was a little bit close. Oh, so that means that probably all the major Hawaiian islands put together are about the size of Israel. Probably. That's a better theory. I'll go with that one. Never let the facts get in the way of a good theory. Okay, we're going, all right. So back to Assyria. We're looking at, what we're going to do, just to give you a big picture, is we're looking at all these issues from the point of view of the big empires at this point. So we're looking at all this stuff from an Assyrian point of view largely, and then from a Babylonian and then Persian. Then we'll flip around as we go start looking at the Hebrews, and we'll look at the whole thing from a Hebrew point of view, okay? So we'll go back there. It's just that we're contextualizing at this point. So the northern kingdom is wiped out. The southern kingdom is still there, remember. You still got over 100 years left of southern kingdom after the northern kingdom is gone. We'll come back to that later too. And the Assyrians are still there. So the Assyrians aren't going to stop with just conquering the northern kingdom. They want the southern kingdom too, right? So they keep coming. And so Ahaz, he was the southern kingdom from Judah, who appealed for aid to Tiglath-Pileser III. And then Hezekiah becomes king, and he rebels against the Assyrians. So naturally, the Assyrians want to take him out. But Sargon, King Sargon of Assyria, is busy. Remember, because you rule by fear, there's all these little revolts that he's got to deal with, right? He's got to remove a bunch of people's skin and chop off their fingers. It takes a while to do all that stuff, right? So he takes some broomsticks east for a while, and he's busy over there. And then King Sennacherib becomes king, and he comes back now, and he's going to show Judah, the southern kingdom, who's boss. Hezekiah, meanwhile, builds some alliances with Egypt, Babylon, Philistines, Phoenicia, Syria, and there becomes a confrontation in the year 701 as the Assyrian king Sennacherib comes down and attacks. He first of all took Tyre and Ashkelon and Ekron and 46 cities in Judah, laid siege to the city of Lachish, laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. Hezekiah is king of Jerusalem, and according to the Assyrian records, he wrapped up King Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Like a bird in a cage. The siege of Jerusalem is talked about at some length in 2 Kings and also in the book of Isaiah. There is a debate, I should note, on the date here. The debate is was there one invasion in 701? Is that when this happened? Or were there two invasions, one in 701 and one in 688? And the two invasions are talked about, they're kind of pulled together in the Bible as one. Hard to tell. The evidence isn't real strong one way or the other. In any case, King Hezekiah ended up paying a large tribute, right? This is you pay money to buy off the king, and the king went away. Here we have the this prism, they call it the prism of Sennacherib. This is his records of these accounts. This is where he talks about Hezekiah wrapped up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. By the way, notice what's happening here. We have all these biblical references to Assyrian stuff going on. You also have Assyrian references to Hebrew stuff going on, right? So you have kings like Hezekiah named and the siege of Jerusalem named. So you get to look at it from both sides. So you have really nice confirmation and sort of two light bulbs shine on the situation, which is kind of nice. Here also, we have Hebrew records of the siege of Lachish. Here we have an Assyrian artwork of the siege of the Hebrew city of Lachish. This is part of that whole series of artworks that showed at the end after the Assyrians took the place, they hanging the Hebrews up on broomsticks. Esarhaddon was the king who kind of saw the last glory days of Assyria. He took over Egypt. King Manasseh paid him tribute and submitted. But then when King Ashurbanipal became king in the 600s, Egypt rebelled, then Babylon rebelled, then Media rebelled, then Scythia rebelled, etc. He's the guy who had that nice library that we have available to us, but he also, as a king, was failing. He's losing power now as all these revolts are starting to take their toll over against the Assyrian king. After he dies, there is a disputed succession who's going to be the next king. And in this time of weakness of the Assyrian kings, one of those rebellions finally took hold. It started in the city of Babylon under the leadership of a guy named Nabopolassar. And finally, Nabopolassar successfully pulled together an army that defeated the Assyrians, besieged the city of Nineveh, and in 612 destroyed the city of Nineveh, thus ending the Assyrian Empire and launching the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He is the first king of Neo-Babylon because they came from Babylon with this rebellion. 612 then is the year. Archaeologists have excavated, especially there was a major dig in 1991-92, sponsored by National Geographic. Archaeologists excavated at the city of Nineveh, and in particular at the city gate. The city gate tends to be, in terms of archaeology, one of the most fruitful places to excavate. You learn a lot about a city because of what goes on in the city gate. There's lots of commercial things that go on, there's storage, there's fortifications, you see the city walls and how they protected the city gate. We'll talk a lot about that later. And of course, in this final fateful battle, when a city is besieged and is finally taken by the enemy, usually that battle takes place at the city gate. Nineveh was destroyed, sacked, and then abandoned. So what was there from that final battle remained. When archaeologists excavated, they found something truly extraordinary. In front of and strewn through that city gate were hundreds of Assyrian bodies. And when they started, here's an archaeologist excavating one of them. You can see the body there that he's working. And when they finally excavated these bodies, they found something very interesting. They did not find one complete body in one piece. Every single body had been hacked to pieces. This is the wrath of vengeance wrought by people who had been oppressed by Assyrian fear for centuries, and this is payback. Now it's time for Babylon. Babylon, as you will see, Neo-Babylonian Empire will not last very long. But nevertheless, it will be a spectacular empire in its own way. You can see the dates begin with the destruction of Nineveh in 612. They last until 539 with the conquest of King Cyrus of Persia. I'm only going to spend a couple minutes on this because while Babylon is very important for Hebrew history, the Babylonian Empire is short-lived and its influence is short-lived. The key king, the big king of Neo-Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar, or you'll see it spelled Nebuchadrezzar. It's a little bit of a challenge to know how to transliterate that name into English, and you can see his dates. King Nebuchadnezzar is famous for a couple of things. One is he built one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the so-called Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It was a wedding present for his wife. It was essentially a sort of a step pyramid kind of structure, what they called a ziggurat. And on the terraces of this ziggurat, he brought in exotic plants from all over the world and planted them on this thing. So there's this beautiful, of course, it no longer exists, so we don't have any evidence of it except what we have written records of what it looked like, and it was truly spectacular. It also was the world's first automatic sprinkler system. Let me tell you how an automatic sprinkler system works in the ancient world. What you do is you have clay pipes coming from the top of the ziggurat, coming down to essentially a drip system around the various plants on the different terraces. And then you have a lot of slaves, and the slaves carry buckets up and down the thing and pour it into a bowl at the top. That's the automatic sprinkler system. There's even a timer, a guy with a whip, and go. It's terrible. That's who came up with that idea? Okay, so anyhow, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, he fought a great battle, did Nebuchadnezzar, in 605 called the Battle of Carchemish. The Battle of Carchemish is important because there are two other major players of the day. Assyria, remember, and the Assyrians tried to make a comeback. And the other was Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh came trumping up out of Egypt, and so the combination of Assyria and Egypt and some others fought against Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar won. And so the Battle of Carchemish, those are no longer a threat. He's established himself now. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, we have the ministry of Daniel. So we have some prophetic ministry going on. Daniel, Jeremiah. And of course, it is Nebuchadnezzar who will succeed where the Assyrians failed, and that is that they took Jerusalem. So the Assyrians had tried to take Jerusalem and failed. Nebuchadnezzar succeeds in taking Jerusalem. And what does he do when he attacks Jerusalem? He deports the Hebrews. Just like this, so following the Assyrian policy, that big question, what do you do when you conquer people? He followed the Assyrian model and they deported the Hebrews. This is the so-called Babylonian captivity. But the difference is when the Assyrians did it, they deported people and dispersed them throughout the Assyrian Empire. When Nebuchadnezzar did it, he allowed them to stay together. So the Hebrews, and we're not sure, there's debates among scholars just how many Hebrews, how big a group it was that was exiled, but it was clearly not all the Hebrews. But it was a big chunk. It was a good number of people. They were allowed to stay together. And because they were allowed to stay together, they retained their identity as Hebrews and retained the desire to return to their homeland, and some of them will later on. But this is the so-called Babylonian captivity. The date, pretty solid date, 586 BC. And when I say pretty solid, when I give you these dates, I'll explain to you kind of how we get to dates on a lot of these things. But be a little bit careful. Some of them are pretty solid. Some of them are less solid. And you just want to pay attention to the evidence. Sometimes there are chronological disputes, like I mentioned about the siege of Lachish in Jerusalem. Was it 701? Was it 688? There's sometimes arguments about these things. We're trying to take numerous pieces of evidence, archaeological, written evidence from the Assyrians, from the Babylonians, from the Hebrew Bible, and kind of put it all together and make sense out of it. And usually we can do fairly well, but there are some times when we feel like, this is a little bit shaky. This one's pretty good, 586. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by King Nabonidus. Nabonidus ended up being, he was a devotee of the moon goddess. Her name was Sin, no pun intended. And she had a sacred oasis down in what we now call Saudi Arabia. And so he went down there to worship his goddess. He left sort of a regent back in Babylon to rule in his stead. This is always a period of weakness, and it just happened to be the period of time when we see the next new empire arising from the east, the Persians. And ultimately the Persians will unseat the Babylonians and take over the area, and thus Nabonidus will be the last king of Babylon. Here we see the Assyrian Empire in pink, the Neo-Babylonian Empire a little bit smaller in the mixed pink and green. Here is the rather spectacular Ishtar Gate of Babylon. And now we turn our attention to the Persians. Now, the Persians are going to be players in the later period of the Old Testament. So this is sort of a preview of coming attractions, but I wanted to give you the whole big picture so that way it'll be useful to you throughout your time as you go forward. The first king of Persia was a guy named Cyrus. And Cyrus's origins lend themselves to interesting stories. By the way, we learn a lot. Our evidence all of a sudden gets better with the Persians, and the reason it gets better is because we get Greeks writing about it. So now we get not only Persian records and Hebrew records, but we also get Greek records, and it so happens that Herodotus, the great Greek historian, wrote about this period. And so we have another lens, which just helps our understanding a lot better. Let's go back to about 550s BC, and let's go farther east, shall we? We need now to leave this realm of Mesopotamia and the Middle East and go farther east to the land we now call Iran. The people who inhabited this land, there were two major people groups. They were called Medes and Persians. Medes and Persians. And by the way, you'll never understand modern international politics if you don't understand that these people are quite distinct. The Persians are quite jealous of the fact that they are a distinct people group. They're a distinct linguistic group. All the people we've been talking about so far were all Semitic. They all spoke, and the Hebrews are Semitic. They all speak languages that are cousins to one another, and they have cultures that are very similar to each other. The Persians are different. The Persians are Indo-Europeans. The Persian linguistic group, the Persian historical background, and so on is quite distinct from all these other people. By the way, English is Indo-European. Germanic languages are Indo-European. So you have this, and Indian languages, Farsi, Sanskrit, etc. These are all Indo-European. So the Persian language is actually closer to English than it is to Assyrian. And the Persians, and by the way, modern Iranians, this is very important to them, they are not Arabs, right? They're Muslims of a distinct variety, heavily Muslim, not entirely, but they are quite a distinct culture, and that culture creates wrinkles in the relationships among people groups, even the relationships among various Muslim people groups, several of which largely hate each other. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but you've heard of ISIL. ISIS broke off from Al-Qaeda as a group primarily because Al-Qaeda believed that the United States was the biggest threat to them. ISIS doesn't think so. ISIS thinks Iran is the biggest threat. So that's who they believe is their chief enemy, which is really interesting. So even within notorious terrorist groups in the Middle East, this same age-old distinction is still alive and well. In the 550s BC, the Medes ruled the Persians. And the Persians weren't particularly thrilled about it. The king of the Medes was a guy named Astyages, and Astyages had a dream. He dreamed that out from between his daughter's legs flowed water, and the water filled the whole earth. Well, this was a rather kinky dream, and so he asked for some help in interpreting it. And the local dream interpreter said, hey, we know what's happening. The issue from your daughter's womb, that is, your daughter will have a child, and that child will come to rule the whole earth. Well, Astyages was kind of a self-centered, narcissistic tyrant, and he decided he didn't want his grandson or anybody else to rule the whole earth. He wanted to be the big ruler. And so he decided to take steps to prevent this dream from coming true. The first step he took was to marry his daughter off to a Persian. Right? He's a Mede. They're Medes. If he marries her off to a Persian, then any child she has is going to be half Persian, half Mede, low class, and thus unfit to rule. Well, she gets pregnant, and she has that child, and they name the child Kurosh, Cyrus, which means mule, half-breed, right? The story goes on that King Astyages, still wanting to prevent the dream from coming true, confiscated the baby, his grandson, gave it to a local noble and said, I want you to take it and kill it and give me proof. The noble now, carrying the baby, kind of felt uncomfortable, right? Who wants to kill a baby? And so he takes the baby and he takes it to a local farmer and says, I want you to kill this baby and I want proof. Now the poor local farmer, he's got this baby, he goes home, what am I going to do with this baby? And he meets with his wife. And he says, honey, I've had a bad day. She says, you've had a bad day. I had a bad day too. Look, I gave birth to our son and he died. And husband and wife looked at dead baby, looked at live baby, looked at each other and said, So they decided to pull the old switcheroo. They took the royal swaddling clothes off the live baby, put them on the dead baby, put the dead baby up the hillside, told the local noble, hey, look, dead baby. Local noble told the king, look, dead baby. Nobody's the wiser, they raised the live baby as their own. End of story, right? Oh, not end of story, otherwise this wouldn't be a very good story. Fast forward about 15 years. Young Cyrus is in high school. He hangs around with a bunch of boys, and boys will be boys, and they decided to play a game. The game was king for a day. So each boy got to be king for a day, and they got to give orders to the other boys. Well, it came time for Cyrus to be king for a day. And by the way, these other boys were sons of nobles. He was the son of a local farmer. Cyrus started giving orders. None of the local nobles kids would obey him. So he started pulling out whips and started whipping them, threatening them with broomsticks. You know, I mean, and so one of the noble kids went home to his dad and said, "Dad, there's this weird kid at school, this mule, right? He's whipping us and making us do stuff. This is very strange." And Dad said, "Who is that kid? What's his name?" And so he went and he found the local farmer. Wait, I'm not telling the story right. Sorry, he told the king. The king said, "How old is that kid? What's his name?" And the king said to the local noble, "You killed that kid, right?" And he said, "Well, actually, I gave it to the local farmer. He killed the kid. But look, we had a dead baby." So he went to the local farmer, pulled out the broomstick, right, threatened him. And the local farmer fessed up and told him what had happened. King Astyages, he said, "Thank God. All these years I've been feeling so guilty about exposing my grandson to death. And now to find out he's alive, I'm so excited. We got to have a party. Let's have a party." And he tells the local noble that he had gave the baby to in the first place. He said, "Okay, tell you what, we're going to have a great party, and we're going to have it in your honor because you decided not to kill the baby. So you send your sons over. We'll bring Cyrus over. We'll bring the farmer over. We'll have a great party." So they all decided to make his best dish, get everything set up. They had this wonderful steak barbecue. They got through with it. And King Astyages said to the noble, "Hey, do you like your steak?" He said, "Oh, I love that steak. Best steak I ever had." He said, "Great. How'd you like dessert?" He said, "Love dessert." So they pull out dessert. They bring them out on covered platters. They lift off the covers of the platters, and on the platters are the heads and hands of his two sons. He had just been fed the rest. At this point in the story, young Cyrus lets out a primal scream, vows revenge, and runs out of the palace. He succeeds then in gathering together some members, remember he's half Persian, some members of his Persian family and other Persians, and eventually putting together an army, launching a rebellion against his grandfather. He eventually rebelled against his grandfather, took over, and established the leadership now of the Persians over the Medes, which is the beginning of the great Persian Empire, and thus, of course, fulfills the dream. He now launches a campaign of conquest. He starts conquering to the west, and it so happened that it was right at the time when Nabonidus had left Babylon and was worshiping his goddess down in Arabia, and it was a time of weakness for the Babylonian Empire. Cyrus now starts to conquer westward. He started by going north and over into what we now call Turkey, the area of Asia Minor. And there he encountered the great and wealthy kingdom of Lydia. Lydia was famed for its riches. King Croesus, you might have heard that term. We still use the term the riches of Croesus. The riches of Croesus refers to somebody who's just filthy rich, right? Croesus was so wealthy, he had storerooms full of gold and jewels. A background story. Remember, this is Greek, so we have a Greek connection here. Athens, the great center of Greek culture. Solon was a great wise man from Athens, and he made some laws in Athens and then went into voluntary exile after he established the laws. He came to Lydia to visit King Croesus. King Croesus entertained him lavishly, gave him a tour around his palace, showed him these storerooms full of gold and jewels. And at the end of the tour, King Croesus turned to Solon, the Greek wise man, and said, "Solon, so what do you think?" He stands up. "Who is the happiest man in the world?" Who is the happiest man in the world? And Solon said, "Well, you know, there was this young man who fought for Athens in a very desperate war. He acted heroically and saved his people and died in battle. I think he's probably the happiest man in the world." Well, Solon said, well, okay, who's the second happiest man in the world? Solon said, well, you know, there were these two young men whose mother wanted to go worship a goddess, and their ox was lame, and she couldn't take the cart. So the young men tied themselves to the cart, and they took their mother to the temple of the goddess so that she could worship there. And everybody so admired them. When they got there, much to the praise of all the women who were around them, the two young men fell down and died. I think probably they're the second happiest people in the world. At which point, Croesus said, what was this story about all these stupid dead people? Are my riches so contemptuous to you that I'm not one of the two happiest in the world? At which point Solon said, oh, Croesus, you don't understand. Call no man happy until he is dead. Until then, he's not happy, just lucky. Well, a couple of years later, King Croesus decided that he wanted to engage in a campaign of conquest to increase the land under his control. The eastern border of his kingdom was at a place called the Halys River. And so King Croesus went to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, a great Greek center of prophecy, and he asked the goddess there, or the priestess of the god Apollo, should I go on this campaign of conquest? And the god famously answered, if you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire. Well, it so happened that Cyrus of Persia was just coming up to the Halys River. And he thought, ooh, wow, I'm going to go conquer Persia. All right. So he went and crossed the Halys River and attacked Cyrus and destroyed a great empire, namely his own. He was defeated. Lydia was conquered. And at this point, Cyrus was going to have him executed. He built a pile of wood and put King Croesus on top of the pile of the wood, and he lit the wood on fire. And just as the fire was getting started, he could hear Croesus up on top of the pile of wood saying, oh, Solon, if only I had listened to you. Cyrus was very curious about what he was saying, so he had them put out the fire, and he pulled King Croesus down, and he asked him what he was moaning about, and he told him the story of call no man happy until he is dead, and King Cyrus was so impressed he decided not to kill him, but to make him his chief advisor. So at that point forward now, King Croesus becomes advisor to King Cyrus, and continues his campaign of conquest. He now works his way down to Babylon, actually diverts part of the Euphrates River in order to lower the level to get in under the walls, and ultimately he takes the city of Babylon, thus putting an end, or if you will, adding to his own, the great Babylonian Empire. He will eventually work his way down, and his son will add Egypt to the Persian Empire. This will be a truly monstrous and extraordinary empire. By the way, now, King Cyrus has to answer those big questions. Nobody gets a pass on this, right? If you're going to conquer, what's the big question? What now? Right? What now? Are you going to deport? Are you going to rule by fear? Are you going to rule by love? Right? These are the great questions. And King Cyrus, for the first time in human history, says, you know what? I want people to love me. I want people to motivate me and obey me so they won't rebel against me. I want them to want to. And therefore, I'm going to try to treat my people well. So he launched a policy, a unique policy in the ancient world, a policy of what you would call maybe adaptation and toleration. The idea of taking in people from different countries, different backgrounds, different languages, different religions, and saying it's okay to be who you were. Let's figure out how we can all contribute to make this thing called the Persian Empire better. It was truly extraordinary. And the Hebrews, by the way, were one of the great beneficiaries of this, but not the only beneficiaries of this. So the Persian Empire is going to be an empire of a different stripe. You will read in the book of Ezra about the decree of Cyrus. When Cyrus says to the Hebrews, I don't want you deported. You're sitting here in Babylon. Why are you in Babylon? If you're going to be in Babylon, that's fine. But you know what? I want some of you to go back to your homeland. I'll even support you. I'll even let you have your own governor. By the way, I want you to rebuild your temple. I'll even help fund it. And when you rebuild your temple, worship your God. And by the way, pray for me. Now, interesting, we know about this policy of Cyrus, not only from the Hebrew Bible, we know it from other sources. Cyrus did this with a number of different people. So people who had felt the oppression of Assyria and Babylon and the calculated cruelty, King Cyrus will come along as a breath of fresh air. And remember, if you're a polytheist, there's always room for one more God, right? So you let these people worship their own gods, and the idea is you get the support of these multiple gods rather than the opposition, as you had in the past. So this is the story of the return of the Hebrews to their land, the rebuilding of the temple, the story told in Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, etc. The big kings, for biblical purposes, are King Cyrus himself, followed by King Darius I, followed by King Xerxes I, that the Hebrew Bible calls Ahashverosh. He is the husband of Queen Esther in the book of Esther. Here is the Great Persian Empire, to give you some idea of just how massive this thing was. And long-lived. Here is King Cyrus, and this cylinder that we see to the left, which is about 3 feet long, is an account of many of his policies, etc. And it has numerous references on there to different people groups that he encouraged to go back to their land and rebuild their temples and so on. So this is not the Hebrew policy is part of a larger policy. So in other words, this text nicely confirms the text we have at the beginning of Ezra, that this was indeed a policy of King Cyrus. Here's one of his capitals, Persepolis. And here is the tomb of Cyrus. Here is King Darius I. You can see he's the big guy. And he is worshiping, by the way, he's holding up his hand in honor of his new chief god. This is the god of Zoroastrianism, the god Ahura Mazda. He builds cars now. Here he is up here, Ahura Mazda. This is a dualistic. Yeah, I know. Hey, I drive a Miata. It's good stuff. That god takes care of things. It's good. So there's King Darius there. This is what we call, by the way, the Behistun inscription. This is outside of Baghdad in Iraq, and it's the ancient Mount Rushmore. It's several hundred feet up the face of a cliff and inscribed in the face of the cliff. So this is a big, massive inscription. By the way, King Darius is also known to Greek history. He's the guy who first invaded Greece and fought in the Battle of Marathon. You might have heard of the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC. A major defeat for the Persians, as it turns out. His son, this is Darius sitting on the throne. This is his son Xerxes behind him. His son Xerxes sought revenge. He also invaded Greece. You might have seen the movie 300 and the sequel. That is Xerxes and the invasion of Xerxes, one of the great battles of ancient Greece, once again defeating the Persians. That in 480 BC. So there we have it, the three great empires of the Iron Age, Assyria, Neo-Babylon, and Persia. And these three really form the background of most of the Old Testament. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't pay attention to local power structures as well. These are just the big empires, but around them were other little smaller players that we need to pay attention to. First, the Philistines. The Philistines are really interesting. Unfortunately, in modern English language, we still use the adjective Philistine. So I, for example, tell my friends who like wine tasting that I have a Philistine palate. A Philistine palate means I'm really lousy at wine tasting. I can't, but that way I can get by with cheap wine, right? Anyhow. But so Philistine, the adjective as we use it in modern English is kind of like barbaric, uncouth, uncivilized. Actually, the Philistines were the opposite. The Philistines were the most civilized, the classiest people around during this period of time. The Philistines had, you can see from the pottery here, there's some of the nicest pottery of the region in the ancient world. They had some of the nicest buildings. They had some of the nicest temples. So the Philistines, by the way, you have this very interesting moment in time in 2 Samuel where the Philistines had developed iron technology and the Hebrews had not. Do you remember that? And in all of Israel, there was nobody who could take care of their plows, their tools, their iron tools, because the Hebrews were still in the Bronze Age. They had to send over to the Philistines to get them sharpened and so on. Of course, the Philistines are not going to sell them weapons, right? Very quickly, of course, that's just a snapshot in time where you have one group that's in the Iron Age. They're more advanced, and the Hebrews are more backwards. Of course, the most famous Philistine was Goliath, right? Goliath of Gath. I should tell you one other thing about the Philistines. The Philistines are along the coast. And the Philistines, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, show up on the coast of Israel about 1100 BC, between 1100 and 1000 BC. They just show up on the coast. What's really interesting, I speak as an archaeologist, if you go to those Philistine sites, and if you dig down to the lowest layers, where the Philistines first showed up on the scene, you will find some pottery there. There's this very thin-walled, plain gray-colored pottery. We call it minyanware. If you go to Greece, to the great citadels, Bronze Age citadels of Mycenae and other Athens and other places like that, and you go to the top layers there, you will find the same pottery, which is to say these may well have been Greek refugees. That these Greek sites were destroyed right about the same time, and then all of a sudden people with the same pottery show up on the coast of Israel. Fascinating. Egyptian records tell us about some sea peoples attacking along the coast of Egypt and really stressing the Egyptian military, but they eventually deflected them away, and that's when they landed on the coast of Israel. So the Philistines are major players and may be descended from the Greeks. The curious thing is that if they are, and the pottery seems to indicate that, they stopped speaking Greek and started picking up local Semitic language. It's very strange. Here are the major Philistine sites along the coast here. What we now call the Gaza Strip, where Hamas rules, this area along here. You see Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath. These are the major Philistine cities there along the coast. Archaeologists have recently started studying what they think and excavating at what they think is the ancient city of Gath, where Goliath was from. And you can see just a brand new excavation here a couple years ago, and they're just starting to get some walls emerging. But they have found Philistine wares here and Philistine structures, and Gath before this had not been identified, so we think this is probably the place. Another very important regional power are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are also a Semitic people, and they are centered in what we now call Lebanon. Their main cities were Tyre and Sidon. Okay, so over here, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut. You've heard of Beirut, Lebanon, that whole area, okay? The Phoenicians are best known as great seafarers. They're really interested in seaborne trade. They get on their boats and they go around places. And they founded these trading posts all over the place. So they founded trading posts all the way over here in Spain. Sardinia, Corsica, Marseille, the modern city of Marseille, they founded the modern city of Marseille. Okay? The modern city of Carthage, they founded the city of Carthage. It actually became a Phoenician city for quite a long time until the Romans ultimately conquered it. Every place in brown basically is a place of major influence, a trading post that the Phoenicians were involved with. For our purposes, the Phoenicians are important for two reasons. One is they have control of the major lumber supplies. There are the only large trees that grow in the region. They're called cedars of Lebanon. Cedars of Lebanon. I have one in my backyard. They're very cool. Cedars of Lebanon. When I built our house a few years ago, and I put cedars of Lebanon and roses of Sharon. Right, I got my Hebrew garden going on. And pretty soon I'll have beams for my temple. If you remember, Solomon traded with the king of Tyre to get beams of cedars of Lebanon to use in the temple. Also, this is very important, of course, because our most important Phoenician that we have in Kings is who? You know? Jezebel. Yes, we have a marriage alliance between the family of Omri and Ahab and the kings of Tyre, and Jezebel is the connection. Okay, so and it's the Phoenician religion, the gods Baal, the different Baals, who are a major source of challenge for the Hebrews at certain points. So that's Phoenicians. Closer to home, there are the regional powers of the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. So whenever you see all these ites that you're seeing, now you're going to know who these people are. Isn't that nice? So the Ammonites are the daughters of, descended from, remember that story about Lot's daughters, this incestuous relationship? They got pregnant by their dad, and one of them had a son named Ben-Ami. His children are the Ammonites, his descendants. His other daughter had a child named Moab, so his descendants become the Moabites. By the way, we know a fair amount about Moabites. We meet the god Chemosh, one of the few gods that demanded human sacrifice in the area. We have King Mesha of Moab, mentioned in this text called the Moabite stone. The Moabite stone is an account of King Mesha's rule and his battles with the Hebrews. So another one of those texts where we have a battle mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and one mentioned in an external text, and we can compare them to each other. Needless to say, you'll see the different points of view coming to bear. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Remember Jacob and Esau, so the Edomites are, and you might remember the city of Petra, the rose-red city of Petra, became one of the lead cities of the Edomites. So here we see the Edomites are down here, Petra is down here. You have the Moabites, east side of the Dead Sea, and then you have the Ammonites. By the way, the modern capital city of Jordan is called Amman, Ammonites, right? Still keeping that terminology. By the way, you know your geography of seas. You know about Red Dead Med. You know about Red Dead. You know about Red Dead Med? Red. Dead. Med. Now you got it. Okay. Red Dead Med and Galilee. Okay. It's the only freshwater one, so you get the Red Dead Med. That way you can always keep track of where you are. Am I either red or dead or med? Or whatever? Okay. Two other regional powers are important for our purposes. One are the Geshurites. Most people don't pay much attention to the Geshurites, but I do because I work with them all the time. I dig them up. The Geshurites are in the area that we now call the Golan Heights, that contested area on the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee that was an old volcano that separates Israel from Syria. According to the Hebrew Bible, David's first wife was Ma'akah. Ma'akah was the daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. Okay, so she came from that area. They had a son. Anybody know what their son's name was? Close. Absalom. Absalom. So Absalom, who rebelled against David, and when he rebelled, he fled and he went up to Grandpa's house, namely up to Geshur. So King Talmai, Ma'akah, his daughter, you'll see, by the way, several queens will be named Ma'akah after her. And then there are the Arameans. We already talked about them. That's another name for the Arameans is Syria. And by the way, most of the kings of the Arameans were named either Ben-Hadad or Hazael. So there's a bunch of Ben-Hadads and a bunch of Hazaels, so you'll see them popping in and out of the text from time to time. Sometimes they're allies of the Hebrews, sometimes they're enemies, sometimes they're fighting against the Assyrians, often they're getting conquered by the Assyrians, which makes sense since they live right next door. Once again, let's get our map straight. So, red, Galilee, the hills here between Damascus and the Sea of Galilee, those hills are the Golan Heights. That's Geshur. Okay? So I'm one of the directors of the archaeological excavations at Bethsaida, one of Jesus' major home bases in the New Testament, home of at least 3, as many as 6 of the disciples. That's right there in the northeast shore of the Sea of Galilee. And that is, we found sort of by accident that underneath the New Testament city of Bethsaida is the Old Testament city of Geshur. And we had this massively fortified city, I'll show you later, but this massively fortified city that we actually found underneath that dates from the time of King Talmai and David and Ma'akah and real interesting Old Testament connections. By the way, here it is. This is the ancient city gate of Geshur. And let us not forget Egypt. Egypt is still a major player in the region. And for our purposes, early on in our story, Egypt is going to be a major player. And you just see this quick reference in the Hebrew Bible, but it's really important for archaeologists. There was a pharaoh by the name of Shoshank. Shoshank. He didn't make a movie about prison. It gets worse. Let me tell you, I got a lot of bad jokes. In the Hebrew Bible, Shoshank is called Shishak. Shoshank, Shishak, same dude. In 925 or 926, within a year, we have this because we have really good Egyptian records on the chronology here, and we've got good Hebrew records. The two connect rather nicely. So we have a good solid date here, 925, 926. King Shishak or Shoshank led an invasion of Israel. And he destroyed a bunch of cities, including Megiddo. And so what we have, and also Gezer, another place like that, so what we have is a bunch of burn layers. So you see cities getting thrashed. He actually set up a victory stela in Megiddo. That's why we know about that in hieroglyphics. So we know he basically says, I was here and I beat you up, right? And we have a burn layer associated with him. So if we have that burn layer, we can date it so we know anything on top of it is when? Post 926, and anything under it is before 920. That's really nice watershed for us in terms of being able to do archaeology. By the way, so this is very important for us in archaeology. So whenever you are looking at this and you find this layer where he attacked, and you read the text about it, this, by the way, happened during the time of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, right after Solomon. Okay, so we know that we can always date the Shishak attack. Right, the Shishak attack. Always look for the Shishak attack. All right. Later on, another pharaoh will come into play. That will be Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. I already mentioned the Battle of Carchemish in 605 when Pharaoh Necho was defeated. What I didn't mention was that King Josiah of Judah tried to stop him and failed, and got himself killed at the Battle of Megiddo in 609. That was a major tragedy for Israel. Okay, for Judah. I just remind you of this, the 12 tribes of Israel. This is where, kind of our starting point. And here is an attempt. You now know not to take this attempt all that seriously, but here's an attempt by one person to articulate where the tribes were. Some of these are pretty clear where they were, some of them are less clear, but anyhow, the distribution of the tribes. I'd like to conclude this section by looking at the end of the book of 2nd Chronicles, which comes right at that point where King Cyrus has become king. And in the book of 2nd Chronicles, there's this moment of reflection, looking back over what has gone on. Would somebody please read this passage for us? Here, I think I have a mic. Well, it went away. Where'd it go? There we go. Anybody? Somebody? Will somebody take it? Yeah, all right, right here.
The Lord, the God of their ancestors, repeatedly sent his prophets to warn them, for he had compassion on his people and his temple. But the people mocked these messengers of God and despised their words. They scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's anger could no longer be retained, and nothing could be done. So the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men and even chased them after them into the temple. They had no pity on the people, killed both young men and young women, the old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, used the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the place of the king and his officials. Then his army burned the temple of God, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the places, and completely destroyed everything of value. The few who survived were all taken as exile to Babylon, and they became servants to the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. So the message of the Lord spoke through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the servants' years were fulfilled. Just as the prophet had said, in the first year of the king Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he had given through Jeremiah. He stirred the heart of Cyrus to put his proclamation in writing and sent it throughout his kingdom. This is what Cyrus of Persia says: The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a temple of Jerusalem, which is Judah. Any of you who are the Lord's people may go there for the task, and may the Lord your God be with you.
Okay. So remember we talked about the human and the divine, looking at the human and the divine in Scripture. Here is a beautiful case of both, isn't it? Side by side. On the one hand, we have this quick review of all the things we just talked about. Here are all the major happenings. We have records from them all over the place. We have archaeology, then we have burn layers from Shishak attacks. We have pottery. We have ancient coins. We have all this kind of stuff. And we have these major empires coming through and having major effects on the Hebrew people. And then the author takes a step back and says, but look what lies beneath. That ultimately, through all this mess, and a lot of what we're talking about here was pretty awful experiences. It must have been very, very hard to be a Hebrew and live with the Assyrian Empire next door. It must have been pretty awful to see Samaria destroyed. It must have been pretty terrible to have the Hebrews of the south deported. It must have been pretty awful to have the prophets come along and say, you're doing it wrong, over and over again. And yet, despite all that, despite what looks like horrible tragedy, despite death and destruction, and even the destruction of God's own temple, when the chronicler steps back, he says, but take a look. God is not done yet. He has been at work through all this mess. He continues to cherish his people. He is not done yet. Never, ever give up hope. So when we dig into all these human workaday details, let's bear in mind the God who is at work behind the scenes. While we may not see him all that often, he's there, he's at work, and his business is to bring life out of death and hope out of tragedy. Okay, we will now turn our attention to a quick lecture on archaeology. So we'll look at the making of a tell. We will look at tells and stratification, analysis, typology, dating of finds, and connections with written sources. We may not get done with all this today, but that's okay. We'll pick it up next time. Okay, let's think for a minute. So first of all, a tell. This is a tell. So the big question when you want to excavate somewhere is, where do you dig? And you don't just go dig randomly somewhere, right? You want to dig where people lived. So what you look for is a place of habitation. And what you look for is this mound that's artificially created of human debris, right? And here we see one. This is Tel Megiddo that you are looking at. A tell is what the Hebrew word for this mound. That's what it means, a mound. Okay, so in order to understand what's there, let's think like an ancient person for a minute, okay? We're going to found a city. So what are you going to look for in your site? Because, right, we're trying to find the right kind of site. So for your siting of a city, what do you want to be there? Water, right? We need water. A well, a river, a lake, spring, something. Okay, so water. Water. There we go. We got water. Nice and blue. All right, what else do you need? What? Vegetation. For what? All right, you want to eat, right? You can't get by just on drinking. You want to eat. So vegetation would be good. What kind of land would that be? Because do you want to grow stuff or just pick stuff? By the way, that's an important question, Ed. Do you want to grow stuff or just pick stuff? If you want to pick stuff, you don't want to build a city. Because if you're going to pick stuff, then you got to leave to go to where the next stuff is to pick, right? So you can either be a hunter or a gatherer, or you can be an agriculturalist, but you're only going to build a city if you're going to stay put. So that means we're going to be agriculturalists, right? So we need a certain kind of land. What is it? Fertile. That means relatively flat, right? You can't grow crops on a cliff. You can do terraces, but generally fairly flat, right? So we want some fairly flat land. Okay, so let's get some fairly flat land next to our water source. Hey, look at that. What else do you want? Anything else you want, or is this good enough?
Mustard and ketchup.
Mustard and ketchup, okay. Protection, okay. And what does that mean in terms of the land? A hill. So it's a very important rule of history. It's easier to throw things down than up. Right? That's pretty important. So you want to be up. So what you need is a bump. Right? You need a bump. A bump. There we go. A bump near relatively fertile flat land and water. Are we good to go? All right, so let's build our city, shall we? Let's build, let's see. We'll build something green. All right, we'll build something green. Here we go. We'll build a teepee. There we go. There's our city. Isn't that great? We have our city. Aren't you very happy? Now, this is a nice place, right? We got land. We got protection. We got water. Let me teach you another rule of history. If you have something nice, somebody else will try to take it, right? Now, you're already up, but you're not fortified or anything. Somebody comes along and beats you up and knocks down your teepee, right? So we have teepee rubble, right? And, of course, now the people who beat you up and took over, now they're going to rebuild. Because this is a good place. What are they going to use to rebuild? Are they going to use your old stuff? The old stones that you used to build your building? Not at all? They don't want to use anything? A little bit? They could. They're going to use whatever's useful, right? If you've got useful building supplies, they're going to use it. But they're probably going to bring in new stuff too, right? And they're going to build, right? And they're going to build 3 teepees. And they're going to build a wall, because they know the second rule of history now, right? So they're going to build a wall. There you go. Oh, look at that. Now that's a good place, isn't it? But it's not that good because people with, I don't know, brown weapons come along and beat them up and make another pile of debris. And now they're going to rebuild, and they're going to build a bigger wall, right? And maybe they'll put what they call a glacis, a real steep wall there, real steep edge, and put mud on it so that they can pour water over the edge. So if you want to attack, you can fall down. Right? But eventually they're going to get beat up, or an earthquake's going to come along and knock it down or whatever, and you get this, and this, and this, and this, and that's what you're saying. Okay? A layer cake of human civilization. Or if you will, a stratified trash can. Right? This is trash. This is the stuff that wasn't reused as you go along. This is trash. So what archaeologists do is they muck around in other people's trash cans. And by the way, you can learn a lot from people's trash cans. We do this once in a while in my class. We'll go steal somebody's trash can and we'll excavate. Right? And you can learn some really important things. If somebody took your trash can and started to excavate, they'd learn something about you, wouldn't they? Maybe things you don't want them to know. Right? Now, would they know everything about you? Of course not. There's a lot of things that you wouldn't know. But you would know a fair amount of things about. So that's what archaeology is, mucking around in other people's trash. Now, when we excavate this thing, we have 2 choices, right? We can either do the peel the onion method. So these are called strata, these layers, strata. And you can either excavate one stratum apiece, and then do the whole thing, and then go to the next stratum. That would be a nice way to do it, and then take nice pictures as you go, and that sort of thing. But the problem is, that takes a really long time. So my archaeological site is about the size of this campus. Okay? So let's get all of you out there. You'll all be volunteers, and we'll excavate this campus. And one stratum, let's say, is about 1 foot. So we'll excavate this entire campus 1 foot. Okay? And we'll use spoons. All right? How long will that take? Right? We don't use spoons. We use hand trowels. But it's going to take, work duty. It's going to take a long time to do that, and by the way, it costs several $100,000 to host one excavation for 3 months. So chances are that's not what you're going to do unless it's a very small site. If it's a very small site, you can do that. Another method you could use is a trench method, right? You could excavate down, and that way you can see all the strata, but you're only seeing it in one place. So you're rather limited. Or you can do a compromise. And most archaeologists now do a compromise where you can do, if you do a top view, you start like this and you break the whole thing up into a grid, usually 5 by 5 meters, and you excavate one square at a time. One square, one stratum at a time, and then follow your nose. Archaeologists have to have X-ray vision, right? So you excavate here. By the way, you don't excavate the whole thing. You leave about a meter around the edge. And let's say you find a wall. Ooh, what are you going to do now?
Use a jackhammer.
Follow the wall, right? And so you go here. Use that jackhammer. Only on students who say such things. Okay. Right? And, oh, look at that. The wall continues. And so now what are you going to do? Follow your nose. Go to the next part, right? Excavate here. And you see that the wall goes, woo, right? And so on. And you follow it around and see if you can recreate the structure. If you don't find anything, you go down to the next stratum and try again. So this is the kind of thing that modern archaeologists do. And of course, the whole time we're taking careful levels, pictures, and so on. So this is basically what archaeologists do. Here is a trench. This is Heinrich Schliemann, one of the pioneers of archaeology. In 1870, he excavated the city of Troy, ancient Troy. By the way, up to that point, historians thought that the whole Trojan War, Troy was all mythological, it was purely fictional, until Schliemann actually found Troy, right? And you can see the different layers of the strata that he discovered there. Here we already saw a Gath, here the excavation. You can see them at work, finding walls, and doing the initial excavation. Then, of course, we need an archaeologist to work on it, and most archaeologists are volunteers. We bring people out, we train them, and they come in all shapes and sizes. This is Bev, our 70-year-old person who likes to sit a lot. There's, by the way, the hand trowel that we use to excavate, so you can see some idea of it. And of course, we have to have the heavy hitters here. This is a mother and her daughter. This is the hand pick we normally use. The mother wanted to look kind of tough, and she actually is. Here we go. Oh, now this is very important. Archaeologists need to get dirty. So we got lots of dirt. I told you we'll get dirty here. All right, lots of dirt. Look at the knees. They're looking good. And so that's a good thing for archaeologists. And here we have another one. This is how you don't want to look. This is very clean. Do not look clean. This is bad. But actually, John got very dirty that day. He was the sifter. So the buckets of dirt that you excavate out, you put them in a sifter and you sift. And when you sift, you find, hopefully, coins. And he's holding a coin, ancient coin that he found that day, which is always a cause for rejoicing. What's that?
I said, is it like bowls where if you find something you get to go home early?
Sure. Why not? Except we all have to go on the same bus, which smells really bad. So now what we want to do is talk about how you analyze what you find. Okay, how do you analyze? And there are two major methods. One you've already been exposed to here, and that is stratigraphy, right? We have strata. So that's analyzing the strata. So you can tell me a few things right away when you look at this. Where's the old stuff? Bottom. Newer stuff is at the top. All right, we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strata. Okay, how much time is between this one and this one? You don't know. All you know is this is older. You don't know how much older. But strata can always tell you relative chronology, but it cannot tell you absolute chronology. So you need to have, but if I have a Shishak attack in here, that's going to help me, isn't it? Because then I have a place as a reference point for before and after. So stratification is good. It tells you relative chronology. Also, if I find something in stratum 3 here, and 20 miles away I'm excavating another place and stratum 6 has the same stuff, I can probably say stratum 3 here, stratum 6 there, they date from about the same period of time. So you can start to see regional patterns develop that way. That's stratigraphy. The other big thing that we use is typology. Typology You actually do typology all the time, though you don't think of it. Anybody watch movies? You ever watch a movie? One of the things you'll notice right away when you start to watch the movie is you have a sense of when it's made, don't you? How do you know? What are the things that your mind automatically tells you, ooh, that's from this period? Video quality is one of them. Good. Or special effects, that kind of stuff. What else? Style, especially clothing, hair, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Technology, good. Technology is a good one. Anything else? Cars is a really nice one. I used to be a car guy. And in my car guy days, I sort of prided myself on I could see any car from a distance and I could tell you what car it was and what year. I can't do that anymore because they all look the same. But back in the day, you could do that. And so you can date things by, unless they're faking it, of course, you got to, if you're doing Schindler's List or something, it's a modern film, you got to make all your cars from the right era. But generally speaking, you can do that. So that's typology. Typology is because we, in this culture, we have anything that's made for a long period of time, it follows patterns, and we know what those patterns are to a greater or lesser degree. So if you can find that kind of thing for the ancient world, something that's preserved, then it works. So for example, we can use pottery, or we can use, say, architecture, or we can use, in Hawaii, they didn't have pottery, but they had fish hooks. And they made fish hooks of different styles out of bones and shells and that kind of stuff. So, but pottery is the big one because we find, the nice thing about pottery is it's fired and it lasts. And it also doesn't last very long. Because if you live in a world where you're standing on rocks all the time and you're using clay pottery, it's only a matter of time before you drop it. And when you drop it, it breaks and you're not even going to bother picking it up because it just kind of smooths out the ground, right? So that's nice. So let me just show you an example of pottery typology. These are cooking pots. So in the ancient world, an oven was a thing that was sort of like one of those burners that you might put for a fireplace on a porch. Kind of a little fire pit like this, and then a chimney that goes up. So it goes like this and has an opening for the wood in the front. So you put the wood in, and then you take the pot and you put it in the top. Got to vent it a little bit, but you put the pot, and so the rounded bottom, and that's how a cooking pot works. So here, forever, from the period of time of the judges, that whole period of time, this is what cooking pots looked like. Okay, there's these rounded globular things, and you have this problem because they get hot and you got to pick them up, right? So how do you pick them up? Well, what they did is they put little flanges at the top so that you could put your fingers around it and pick up the pot and move it. And by the way, cooking pots have been like this for like 4,000 years, 3,000 years before this, okay? So before the time of King David, women, who mainly did most of the cooking in the ancient world as far as we can tell, women have been burning their fingers, right? They've been having cooking pots like this, and these little flanges, and they pick them up, and they put them down, right? For thousands of years. Finally, somebody in Israel, about the time of King David, said, that's stupid, let's have a handle. And they made the world's first handle on a cooking pot. And everybody goes, dude, how cool is that? And so everybody's making, right? And as soon as you get handles on cooking pots now, which date from right about the time of King David, then everybody, right, those flange things go away. You don't need them anymore. And everybody makes cooking pots with handles. That's typology. So you can date your cooking pot. If you have a handle, it's post 1000. If you don't have a handle, it's pre 1000, right? That's very simple. But once you get good at pottery typology, I could teach you in 3 weeks of doing examples, I could teach you to be able to take a few pieces of broken pottery and date something within, say, give or take 50 to 100 years. Okay, it's not that hard. Scholars have been analyzing every single piece of found pottery at every single archaeological excavation in Israel for over 100 years, and it's all cataloged. Okay, so you can really do this analysis with some detail. Here's what stratigraphy looks like on the ground. Here's an excavation that I actually did. So here we have the ground, which is this is a stone paved road, okay? And this is a meter stick. This bottom 10 centimeters, you see is dark gray ash. This is destruction. By the way, Tiglath-Pileser III, that was him destroying this. Then on top of it, you see this red crumbly stuff. For about that far, that's mud brick. Then on top of that, we have gray rocky stuff up to about there, and then we have gray less rocky stuff up above. Okay, those are 4 different strata. So you just see what the strata look like, along with the destruction layer. And now we have the issue of how do we get absolute dates. So we've already talked about pottery, doing typology. You can try it. You can get a pottery date in the time we're talking about, the period of the kings, give or take 80 years or so, you can get a pottery date about that close. Okay, so that's pretty good, and that can date any individual stratum. And by the way, you don't look at a single piece of pottery in a stratum, right? You see the patterns of all the pottery you find in that stratum, and you keep careful track every day of those things. Another way you can do dating is carbon-14 or any sort of radioactive, but carbon-14 is the most common. You can do oxygen-20, you can do a number of other things. Carbon-14 has been fairly controversial, but it's really not. Here's what it is, basically. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope of carbon. So your body, you are a carbon-based unit. Okay, most of you is carbon. And most of the carbon in you is carbon-12, and it's stable stuff. Carbon-14 you ingest from the atmosphere, and it's radioactive. So when you die, the carbon-12 is going to stay the same, but the carbon-14 is going to decay because it's radioactive. So as long as you're not taking it in anymore, it's going to start to decay at a known rate. And it's something like 6,200 years. I can't remember what the half-life is of carbon-14, but it's not that long. So theoretically, you can take anything that was alive, any wood, any plant material, any bones, you can take anything that was alive and you can do carbon-14 dating on it. Carbon-14 dating, then, you're measuring how much carbon-14 is left relative to the carbon-12 that's always there, that ratio. And theoretically, by seeing how much the carbon-14 is decayed, you can see the death of the critter, whether it's a plant or a tree or a human. Does that make sense? Okay, that's all well and good, except that certain things can change the measure, how much you can measure, or the decay rate. So exposure to sunlight, soil chemistry, different temperatures, etc., can change either your ability to read the ratio or the rate of decay. So the result of all of that is that you have to be careful with carbon-14. In general, a rule of history is the farther back you go, the farther off you are when it comes to dates, and that is certainly true with respect to carbon-14. A good carbon-14 analysis is a sealed sample, so it was buried, and you take the sample immediately without any exposure, and you get it to a lab right away. And you have multiple samples, about 5, and you send all those samples to different labs, at least 3 different labs. So you get them to cross-check each other. And then they measure the carbon-14, trying to figure out when did the critter die. Then you compare those results to each other, and that's how you get a good carbon-14 date. Generally speaking, in the period we're talking about, a carbon-14 date will be, a good one will be plus or minus about 200 years, maybe 150. That's okay, and that can help you under certain circumstances, but that's not all that accurate. And, by the way, the farther back you go, the margin of error gets larger and larger. Starts to approach the full sample size, in which case it's 100%. So, basically, if the question you're asking can be answered by getting a date that gets you plus or minus 150 or 200 years, that's great. But otherwise, carbon-14 isn't all that useful. Another thing is one carbon-14 date costs about $300. The lab work's expensive. So pottery dating is free and it's more accurate. And you do it every day. So almost never do we do carbon-14 dates, but under certain circumstances, for example, we had a landslide we were trying to measure. It created in the Jordan River that caused a flood. We wanted to date the flood. Can we date the landslide? The landslide buried a rabbit. We could carbon-14 date the rabbit, right? That's, give or take 150, that's cool, close enough. It gives us a good idea of when that landslide was, and that's a really good use of 14 dates. But otherwise, carbon-14 isn't all that useful. And by the way, be very cautious when you get back before about 1,000, maybe 2000 BC. your accuracy in carbon-14 gets really weak. It's just not even worth using for the most part. One other way that you can get dates, which is really nice, is coins. And by the way, coins are really nice because they have dates on them. Or at least the ruler, who was the ruler at the time, which gives you a range, right? And that gets you pretty close. Of course, coins, you don't find very many because people who lose coins tend to pick them up. So you get lucky when you get coins. And by the way, coins were first minted in 500 BC. So anything before that, we're not going to have coins available to us. But after that, they start to become useful. And a coin in a stratum helps date the pottery. And the pottery helps date the bones, and that gives you a cross-check on your carbon-14. So we're always doing that kind of thing as well. Yes?
I was gonna say, so based on the carbon dating, whether you say it's like it's accurate up to like 100 or 150 years, like so like say like based on a like Noah's Ark and like the flood and all that, like as a Christian, coming from like a viewpoint as a Christian, you're saying that like in a scientific standpoint, like it's only based on so much time, but like what if it was like if it came up to like what you're saying 100 150 years, so if carbon dating or carbon 14, what you're saying, I guess it's just carbon dating, like from a Christian standpoint, pretty much what you're saying is it's not accurate. It's pretty much not accurate at all, like coming from, if you can only base it off a certain amount of time. Like something.
Oh, no, I'm saying carbon-14 is accurate within about 150 years in this period we're talking about. So for example, here's a big question. When did humans first come to Hawaii? This is actually a really big question for historians, right? When did humans first come to Hawaii? The only answer we have is carbon-14. South point of this island, there's some sand dunes. Apparently, as far as we can tell, the oldest human deposits are humans ate some shellfish and dumped the shells in the sand dunes. You can carbon-14 date the shells, right? They date to about 400 AD. 400 AD, that's going to be plus or minus about 50 years because it's much closer to the present. That's a pretty good date. So somewhere between 350 and 550, somewhere in there is when the first humans came to Hawaii. We have good evidence of that. That's real solid. But when you go back, so that's 400 AD. When you go, we're talking now King's period, nearly 1000 BC. Now you're talking about the rate of error is more like 150, 200 years. When you go back older than that, it becomes 200, 500. The margin for error starts to get very, very large, so your confidence gets less and less as you go back. Okay? So no, I think you can be, carbon-14 is useful. I don't want to say it's inaccurate or bad. It's just that you always have a margin for error, and the farther back how the stuff is that you're trying to measure, like a Noah's Ark kind of thing, which of course you have to have a piece of it to be able to measure, but if you had a piece and you tried to measure it, then you're a long time back. Your ability to measure it's going to be really a problem. So carbon-14 isn't a very useful tool for doing that thing that far back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was
Okay. Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. A lot of Christians either want to think that carbon-14 is like this super reliable tool or not useful at all. It's neither one. It's uses of it, and there are problematic uses of it, and we want to be intelligent about using it well. And for the most part, archaeologists don't use it, except in things like South Point, where it's really useful, right? It's the best thing we have available to us. Yeah. Okay. So in closing, I would just want to say this. Just a couple things. Here's some dead bodies that we measured. Here's some ancient goat poop that we measured. So you can carbon-14 date ancient goat poop. A lot of people say funny things about the relationship between the Bible and archaeology, and you'll hear people say these two things. The archaeology proves the Bible wrong. Archaeology proves the Bible true. It does neither. Both of those are misstatements, and we shouldn't get caught up in that kind of stuff. Archaeology is a tool, and it is one way that we can learn certain kinds of things. Only things you can learn from trash, right? But to the extent that we can learn from trash, that's good. It's a useful tool for us. What archaeology Archaeology cannot prove a written text wrong. That's not possible. But archaeology can corroborate, I like that word, corroborate, confirm a particular statement in a particular written text. Right? So if the text says, as the Bible does, Tiglath-Pileser III attacked Israel, and we find a burn layer that fits, and we find an inscription externally that fits, those things corroborate that one statement in the text. When Homer says that the Greeks fought a war against the Trojans and Heinrich Schliemann found Troy and found artifacts from the Greeks in that era, then the result is that the archaeology has corroborated that particular claim of the text. Not the whole thing, but that particular claim of the text. What I would prefer to say is this. Archaeology and the Bible, or archaeology in any written text, they mutually illuminate one another. Mutually illuminate. They shed light on each other. Archaeology helps us understand the Scripture clearly. The Scripture helps us understand the archaeology more clearly. We want them to be in conversation with each other. We want them shedding light on each other so that our understanding becomes fuller. If our objective is to understand the Scripture, then we want that added light that archaeology offers us. And at times it does corroborate particular statements in the text. But let's not make claims we can't substantiate. Over and over again, archaeology does corroborate certain statements in certain texts. But more than anything, it sheds light on our task. And it's the light we want, after all. So, the Bible says that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. And I kind of like that image, that we want as much light as we can have. And what you will see happen is archaeology sometimes will confirm our understanding of a particular text of the Bible. Sometimes it will challenge our interpretations. Sometimes it will cause us to make connections we otherwise wouldn't make, and in the process sheds light on it sheds light on a text that we otherwise would possibly misunderstand or confuse. Archaeology can help us with all those things. And I hope you've already seen from some of these archaeological discoveries the types of light that we can expect to see. And over again, we do see those opportunities arise before us because of the light shed by a whole lot of hard work in the field of archaeology. So with that in mind, let us have a prayer. Lord, we thank you for the hard work of so many people in studying the text of the Bible and studying archaeological sites and ancient history. Lord, we thank you for all the beams of light provided for us, and may we be stewards of that light as we seek to understand you and your word. In Christ's name, amen.